Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last session of EuroVA 2021. And we're now ready for our keynote, and I'm really happy to introduce Miriah Meyer to you, who will give the keynote today. She's professor in the School of Computing at the University of Utah and faculty member at SKI, Utah. And she's also co-director of the EuroVis Design Lab. And among the many awards she received is the NSF Career Award, for example, and she's also TED Fellow. And we are really excited to have her today as our keynote speaker for the keynote, A Tool is Not Enough, Research Contributions Through Design Study. And I'm quite happy to give the word to Miriah now. And we're looking forward to your capstone and keynote. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this invitation to be here today, especially after this year when none of us have had nearly enough opportunities to get to talk about our research. So I really appreciate getting to talk with you, well, this morning here in Utah and afternoon over in Europe. And I'm really excited to talk today about some thoughts about how tools are often not enough anymore and how we can generate really diverse contributions through design study. So we're going to be talking about visualization design study, which is an approach to applied visualization research. So in a design study, visualization researchers collaborate with domain experts, learning about their domain and their data in order to develop sophisticated bespoke tools that can help them with their data analysis. Now, design study is distinguished from other types of applied and design-oriented viz research by their focus on deep collaborations, a reliance on data and task abstractions for design requirements, and a goal of deploying tools back into the hands of domain experts. Well, design study first came into the Viz lexicon back in 2003 at the then EuroVis symposium at the Viz conference. And at this time, the program chairs, Tamara Munzner and Stephen North, included design study for the first time in paper types descriptions for the CFP. And this inclusion came after a trend in the community towards embracing more applied viz research and a push from Tamara in particular to elevate this research as a first-class citizen. Tamara then expanded the description of what goes into design study into a design study report in her 2008 Process and Pitfalls paper. She expanded it into two paragraphs. But it was during this period that the community was increasingly submitting applied viz work under this label of design study, but with very little methodological guidance or consistency on how to actually conduct them. So in 2012, Michael Settlemeyer, Tamara, and I proposed a more formal definition and methodology for design study. And we proposed that a design study is a project where we analyze a real world problem, so real people and real data are necessary. We then design a visualization system to support that problem, validate the design in the wild by deploying tools back into the hands of our collaborators, and finally then reflect about the lessons we've learned along the way in order to generate new knowledge for the community. Well, since we introduced this methodology nearly a decade ago, the viz research community has continued to theorize about design study through the development of a number of different theoretical models. And these models help us to structure the design process. They provide guidance on appropriate methods to use throughout design study, and they describe how we can validate a visualization system in the wild. Now, the result of all this theoretical work over the last decade is that there's now over 150 published design studies that span a broad range of application areas from biology to meteorology, sports analytics, and digital humanities. And the majority of these papers claim a bespoke tool designed for a group of experts as the core and often primary contribution of the work. They also tend to follow a pretty standard template for reporting, including a characterization of the domain, an abstraction of the data and analysis tasks, a description of the tool design that supports those tasks, and often some sort of case study that describes how the tool was used by collaborators. After a decade of publishing design studies, however, there are questions about what we as a community have learned from all of this design and engineering work. And in his provocative belief paper from last year, Michael Carell delivered a very pointed critique to design study, arguing that building a tool and reporting that people like it is at best uninformative and at worst can be misleading. He took the position that building tools for others is a valuable endeavor, but is not on its own a research contribution. Now, I actually tend to agree with Michael that the normative ways we have come to conduct and report on design studies have failed to provide considerable knowledge contributions that the community as a whole builds on. But I don't think that this means design study is an unproductive or unimportant approach to viz research. And instead, in this talk, I want to argue quite the opposite. That design study is a very rich opportunity for generating diverse knowledge contributions that are grounded in the ways that visualizations are actually used in the world. And my view is that design study is not a way to design tools, but is rather a way to inquire about how and why visualization works. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to walk you through some examples of the varied contributions that have emerged from design studies conducted in the Viz Design Lab here at the University of Utah, including those that question some of the visualization dogma that we hold near and dear, that extend the toolbox of methods that we have to bring to collaborative design-oriented work, and also that fundamentally help us understand the relationship of people and data. So after I go through some of these examples, I want to talk about why they're hard, why these types of this type of knowledge is hard to get from design study and to publish under our current standards, and then talk about a new framing for how to think about design study as a method of inquiry. From here, I'll briefly present results of some recent work that shows how this framing can help us generate a wealth of contributions. So let's dig in. Okay, so in questioning visualization dogma, here I want to talk about a design study that we conducted with meteorologists who are also wildfire forecasters. And this was a project that was headed up by a student of mine, Sam Quinnen. And so these meteorologists spend a lot of time doing what thousands of meteorologists across the world do, which is looking at weather predictions over time. And they then use these predictions in order to better understand predictions for wildfire forecasting, and namely where to send resources for future possible wildfire events. And it's a pretty big deal in places here like the Western US and in other parts of the world. So when we started working with some fire forecasters here in Salt Lake City, they were really talking about how overwhelmed they were with a broad range of visualizations that meteorologists all over the world are using. And so when we started working with them, we did the very standard stuff. We conducted contextual interviews in their workplace, and we attended daily briefings in order to better understand their workflows and the challenges that they were encountering. We also augmented our interviews and observations by collecting over 40 visualizations that our collaborators used on a daily basis. And then we coded these images by what data they were showing and how that information was visually encoded. From these data sources, Sam designed a new tool that provided our collaborators with views that used interactivity to reduce visual clutter. And we also introduced some new techniques for visualizing uncertainty. The visual conventions in this tool pulled from the standard views our collaborators were used to, but we sort of tweaked and nudged them towards some guiding visualization design principles. And after the project was over, we spent some time reflecting on our design process. And one of the things that really struck us was the prolific use of views that violated fundamental visualization principles. In particular, our collaborators and thousands of other meteorologists around the world use views that discretize continuous data fields such as temperature and pressure. And this goes against the expressiveness principle, which says the visualization should show all of the data and only the data. And so meteorologists, turns out, they also make extensive use of rainbow color maps, which is a practice that we in the community really love to hate on. But what really excited us here was the idea that there are these trained experts who use visualization every day, and their practice does not align with the principles we hold near and dear. And so we took the perspective of, instead of saying, oh, those silly meteorologists, they just don't know any better, instead saying, well, maybe there's something about these visual conventions that we just don't really understand. So Sam and I collaborated with Lace Padilla and Sarah Kremberger to design some follow-up studies to better understand, in particular, the use of discretization. And so we designed a study where we had participants walking through various different levels of discretized data, and we had them perform 12 different tasks based upon the things we saw our meteorologists doing. And the really interesting thing that came out of this study is that there wasn't a single task where the continuous fields performed better. And there was, in fact, some tasks where the discrete color maps led people to be more accurate. And so this was really interesting to us because it points to there being something very interesting going on cognitively and perceptually with these discretized maps. We also did some follow-up work to look at rainbow color maps and the sort of strong use of them in this community, because we had some hints that, maybe part of why these meteorologists like these rainbow color maps is because they are implicitly discretizing the data. And so we were able to do a follow-up study that did in fact show that rainbow color maps do implicitly discretize data in these continuous fields, and that is pretty consistent across people. And so this was an example of a design study that then spurred a series of questions for us about trying to understand, are there things that we just don't really know yet about some of the design principles that we hold near and dear? Okay, so that's one example of the kinds of contributions beyond a tool that design study can give us. And now I want to talk about how we can use design study to extend our own toolbox of methods that we can bring to our collaborations. Okay, and so here I'm going to talk about a project where we were working with a team of scientists who were developing techniques to understand the wiring diagram of our brain. They work in a field called connectomics. And while the data for these scientists was seemingly straightforward, it's a large, well, very large network. Mapping the scientific questions to network analysis tasks proved to actually be quite challenging for us. And so after several months of conducting interviews with various members of the lab, my student, Ethan Kersner, who was leading this project, wanted to try something different. He was just getting frustrated by going to one lab member and them saying, this is the really important thing, and then going to another lab member and them saying, no, this is the really important thing. So we somehow needed to get to consensus about what would be a good visualization opportunity for us. And it was about this time that we had read a paper from the GI Center in London, who had run a series of creativity workshops in a design study with energy analysts. And these workshops are a method for quickly and effectively being able to elicit design requirements through structured brainstorming as a group. And in their paper, the Viz team described a host of design requirements that came out of the workshops that they ran, which they then successfully turned into a tool. But what was most compelling to us was that these workshops took a fraction of the time that more traditional interviewing and observation methods take. So Ethan designed and ran a creativity workshop with our neuroscientists, and it was a complete success. He was able to uncover a really broad range of visualization needs of the group in just a single day, as well as to build trust and credibility and agency with the scientists. And in fact, after running this workshop, the PI of the lab, who had basically been dodging Ethan and not really responding to his request to meetings, set up a weekly meeting time with us because he was so excited about the things that we might be able to do. So from this initial workshop, Ethan designed and deployed a visualization tool that explored different patterns of paths within a network, which the scientists are still using today to understand how different types of neurons interact to transmit messages in the brain. Okay, so after this experience, Ethan approached Sarah Goodwin, who was the lead author of that energy analysis paper, just to talk about their shared experiences of running workshops. And these initial conversations led to a 2.5-year collaboration with the group from London, where we collectively reflected on our experiences of running 17 workshops in 10 different projects and on 3 different continents. And the result of all this reflection was a formalized description of creativity workshops for visualization design that was grounded both in our experiences of running these workshops, as well as in the theories behind group creativity. The description that we presented outlines considerations for designing and conducting the workshops, along with a set of brainstorming activities that we have repeatedly used with success. And these workshops have really become an absolute core method in our research group, and we run them for almost every project that we conduct. And I do speculate that for each project, these workshops save us months of time that would otherwise be spent using more traditional interview and observation techniques. And so in this was an example of how we use design study in order to experiment with and to extend existing methods that we can use for collaborative visualization design work. Okay, and the third example of contribution is about how we can use design study to better understand the relationship of people and data. And so in this example, I'm going to talk about a project that I worked on with another student, Nina McCurdy, where we were collaborating with global health experts who were working to understand and stem the spread of the Zika virus and its associated health risks in Latin America, notably microcephaly in babies who are infected in utero. So this design study began with Nina conducting a 6-month field study at the USAID in Washington, DC, which is a large global health organization. And when we started this project, it had all the signs of a straightforward design study. Our experts had data. They had tried to incorporate standard visualization tools into their workflow and failed. And they were excited to work with us on some innovative ideas. So Nina went to DC and we dug in. Now, during the field study, Nina developed and deployed a prototype tool to explore Zika outbreak data, along with data about in-country programs that international organizations had in place to combat the disease. And ultimately, the goal of this tool was to help our global health expert collaborators make decisions about whether or not to move or expand various programs based upon what they were projecting as the status of the outbreak. When Nina evaluated this tool with multiple stakeholders, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The feedback indicated to us that the design that Nina had come up with was really an effective representation of the data. And yet, when we deployed the tool to our immediate collaborators, we noticed a real hesitance from them to actually embrace it for use in their day-to-day work. And so in probing the reluctance, we came to understand that although the tool was a good reflection of the data itself was not an accurate reflection of what these experts knew to be true about the outbreak in the region. And this first came up in a discussion of a choropleth showing Zika case data at the national level. Here, for example, we're looking at Brazil in dark red, which indicates a relatively high percentage of cases, whereas Colombia has a lighter orange, indicating a lower percentage. And so when we were discussing these maps with one of our collaborators, she noted that while Brazil reports all cases, Colombia runs a full investigation before making any reports. And the implication was that the difference in how these countries are reporting Zika case data resulted in aggregated data that presents an inaccurate and possibly misleading picture of the situation. And even though that we ran this design study a number of years ago, I would imagine many of you, this sounds very similar to what we've been hearing about for COVID data over the last year as well. And so we pivoted to focus on this problem and discovered that although the data was littered with discrepancies like this, the experts actually had very deep and intimate knowledge about the errors and where they stemmed from. And so in the case of Zika data, the discrepancies came from the fact that the underlying data is collected, processed, and reported in different ways. And it was really this distributed, heterogeneous data generation pipeline that's implemented in a different way in every country, leaving the data with subtle variations in how the underlying data was generated and processed, the vast majority of which go undocumented and unaccounted for. And so each country's data generation pipeline was shaped by its local political, cultural, economic, geographic, and demographic context. And it resulted in discrepancies like the union in region X goes on strike often and doesn't report Zika data, or country Y recently overhauled its surveillance system, leading to a sudden increase in detected cases. And so from here, what we did is we abstracted the idea of data discrepancies to a concept that we called implicit error. And so we defined implicit error as measurement error that is inherent to a given data set, that's assumed to be present and prevalent, but is not explicitly defined or accounted for. So we developed a characterizing description of implicit error, as well as a process model that describes how it can be externalized and captured in a viz tool. And so although this work was grounded in our design study with Zika experts, we speculate that this kind of implicit error is prevalent in many, many other fields. So when we wrote up our work, we actually really struggled with how to report on these findings. We didn't release a new visualization tool, nor did we have any innovative new viz techniques. All the design work Nina did was using just good standards of practice. But instead, what we had was findings about the relationship our collaborators had with their data. And so when we drafted our paper, we ended up spending a significant portion discussing our research process, as this actually felt like the more appropriate balance given the nature of our core finding. But this actually felt like a really risky thing to do, as it went against established norms for reporting on design study. And honestly, our reviewers were lukewarm to our lack of visualization system details or innovative new viz techniques. And so after this work, I was talking with Jason Dykes about the struggles that we were having with design study, namely that our most interesting things that we were learning were not actually new viz techniques. And this actually resonated with his experiences as well. And so this led him and I to reflect on our experiences and to work on redefining design study as wicked, subjective, and diverse. And so the new perspective that we took focuses on design as a method of inquiry. The process of design is how we as design study researchers learn about the world, but it also uses design as a method of expression. And so what we're learning, we actually express through the things that we design. So this is also an approach to research that tackles wicked problems, which are design problems that have unbounded potential for solutions. And so the limitless nature of design study is due in part to the fact that designing a visualization inevitably affects the problem itself. It shifts and shapes the goals of the project as we go. But it's also limitless due to the fact that design study is inherently subjective, with the results representing the design study researcher's specific view of the problem and a good solution. And so as design study researchers, we make millions of decisions throughout the design process, from small aesthetic choices, even through who to interview and what to ask them. And so finally, design study can produce diverse and wide-ranging contributions. So sometimes design studies do result in an interesting new visualization technique or tool, but they also offer us opportunities to learn many interesting things about how people think about and interact with data. This view that we propose of design study, however, is at odds with how we as a viz research community tend to think about and assess our research practices. So as a field, visualization research values validity, reliability, and objectivity. And these are the core values of positivism, which is pervasive through our research practices. But positivism is fundamentally misaligned with wicked, diverse, and subjective design study. So the design study researcher is actively trying to disrupt and change the way that people interact with their data. And in this way, the researcher is an active instrument in the process. And striving for the objective distance that positivism demands is the opposite of what we want to accomplish. And then through the design process, as researchers, we learn, our collaborators change their practices, and even the problem you are tackling changes. And ultimately, the unreproducible nature of design study threatens the positivist view of knowledge. which can lead to the question, is it possible to do rigorous design study? And so this was a question that Jason and I spent about 4 years thinking about. And we took a very deep dive into the thinking on rigor in the fields of social science, information systems, and research through design. And our journey started from our own struggles to use existing design study methodologies in our work. And we initially tried to use the positivist notions of rigor, but once we established that design studies were neither reproducible nor objective, we saw that the underlying value system of positivism limits the kinds of research that we can do in design study. This led us to look at other value systems, which introduce different types of rigor criteria, including trustworthiness, quality, and principles from design. So we defined, redefined, and redefined again these existing criteria, trying to make them fit in what we do in visualization design study, but they just didn't. And so finally, we gained the confidence to move away from established criteria, and we developed a new set that supported the wicked, subjective, diverse perspective of design study research. And so in our work, we proposed that rigorous design study is informed and shaped by existing knowledge, that it is reflexive, deeply and purposefully continually considering the role that we as researchers play within the study, that it is abundant in terms of considerations, evidence, and design, and produces plausible claims through a coherent analysis, and that these claims resonate with others, inspiring action and transfer. And ultimately, that the work is transparent in ways that can invite scrutiny. And so we think that these 6 criteria are really important considerations for planning, conducting, and reporting on design study research, as well as how others are going to evaluate it. And so I had my first chance to explore this new approach to design study in a recent project that was led by another PhD student in my group, Jen Rogers. And in this design study, we collaborated with evolutionary biologists who were studying the effects of environmental pressures on the evolution of lizards. Throughout the design study, we used the rigor criteria as a guide for helping us to choose and refine research methods throughout the project. And one of the really critical ways that we experimented was through building an abundant collection of diverse artifacts. Now, throughout the design study, Jen attempted to record absolutely everything she could, and she ended up with over 170 sketches, memos, diagrams, prototypes, email correspondence, text messages, photos of whiteboard doodles, related work, and even paper drafts. And what we found was that this collection of artifacts was a catalyst for reflection, and it drove changes to our visualization designs, as well as a myriad of insights into things that we learned throughout the study. And ultimately, the result was a really rich set of research contributions that fell out from these experiments. Through this design process, Jen developed 2 new techniques for visualizing multivariate trees with uncertainty that she implemented into a tool that we called Trevo. We also had 2 new writing devices. The first one being a paper where we embedded a mini design study within a methodological paper. And then the second writing device being a way of directly linking evidence in the paper itself. So again, building on our abundant collection of artifacts, which we had digitized, we included deep links in the paper so that we could cite evidence throughout it that automatically would pull up the digitized artifact. And then we also had 3 methodological insights. The first one was about how to encourage and support systematic reflective practices, along with evidence about how it changed our design process. The second being how to assess evidence of these new criteria for rigor. And the third being new ways to record, reflect, and report throughout design study. Another thing that we ended up doing with this abundant collection of artifacts was to support transparency by building an audit trail as a companion to the paper. And so Jen developed a web-based interactive timeline where artifacts are represented as these clickable squares. When you click on a square, it pops up the digitized artifact on the right. And this audit trail allows for tracing of our design study inquiry from the beginning to the end. But we found that as we were actually building our audit trail for reporting on design study, it also became an unexpected internal research tool as well. It was actually the act of organizing our artifacts into a timeline that spurred us to reflect on our design iterations, leading us to make further changes to our visualization. And this reflection was aided by a tagging system that we had implemented for the artifacts, which captures high-level concepts related to the artifact, such as the method that we employed in the creation of the artifact, like sketching, or even the biological concept that the artifact related to, like convergence. What this tagging system allowed us to do was to then trace the progress of concepts across the design study. And so our website transformed into a tool that supported more than transparent reporting. It was also serving a vital role for recording and reflecting within the design study itself. And this transformation led to a methodological insight for us, which we formalized into a concept we called TRACE. And TRACE is a construct that supports tracing a design study from multiple perspectives over an abundant collection of artifacts. Now, the capital R's in the word TRACE represent three core research tasks that it supports that we think are really critical for design study: recording an abundant collection of diverse artifacts, reflecting on conceptual developments throughout the study, and transparently reporting on the design study process itself. Now, this work is just a first step towards theorizing about design study traces and their potential to support rich insights and transparent reporting. But popping up a little bit, this design study was really, really influential for me because it showed that by moving our perspective from thinking of design study as a way to design a tool to one that instead lets us probe into how visualization is used, allowed us to come up with a really diverse and new set of knowledge contributions. And so in this talk, I've argued that visualization design study is a productive approach to research that allows us to learn about visualization techniques and research methods, as well as to probe deeply into the relationships of people and data. It's a mode of inquiry that is wicked, subjective, and diverse, and also ill-suited to the normative visualization approaches and values that are grounded in positivism. But our first experiments with approaching design study as a method of inquiry shows that it can lead to a rich set of diverse research contributions. And so treating design study as a method of inquiry, as opposed to a process for designing tools, it does take more time, more training, more methods, and more work. But I really argue that it's worth it because design study is important for our field in order to continue to learn about and impact the ways that visual analysis systems are actually used in the real world. And so with that, I just want to thank you all so much for your attention and for the opportunity to talk about design study in all of its potential glory. I'm happy to take any questions you have. And also, I just want to use this opportunity briefly to say that this fall, I'm going to actually be moving from Utah to Linköping University in Sweden and building a new group there. So if anyone is interested in conducting or theorizing around design studies, please send me a note and I'd love to talk more. So thanks so much.
So, Miriah, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation and giving us lots of food for thought. Maybe while you are thinking about further questions, I will start with one. I mean, we at our lab, we also working a lot with design studies, and what you described in part of your talk was, well, sometimes the WIS community is not, well, taking up some of the contributions that you discovered with your collaborators in a way that would really, well, to accept the paper and to really appreciate it. Do you think that your approach now is a way to open up our WIS community a bit for these contributions, or do you think, well, maybe it's still a pre-study to something more visual that we will have in the end?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm just going to take a bit of an extreme view on, just for the sake of being provocative, which is that I think the hopes and dreams for design studies was not only that we would produce a whole bunch of new techniques that other people would then transfer and use, but also that we would sort of build up this recipe book of like lots of domains that we've characterized and we have data and tasks for, and other people are going to take those data and task abstractions and build yet different tools. But from what I've seen over the last 10 years, that hasn't really happened. That the tools that we're designing are very specific and useful for groups of people, and the ways that they're put together can be innovative, but that it's that a lot of the stuff in there isn't being transferred to other domains, and definitely the abstractions and stuff, I have yet to really see that happen. And so I think it was a good experiment in how this kind of applied work could be useful to the community, but I think the original intentions of design studies have not played out. But I think what at least in my experience and in some of the people I've talked with, design study as a way to just learn about the world by being in the world is the thing that's been super amazing about them, you know, and whatever, I showed some examples of this. And so I think though we're sort of stuck in this position where we've sort of come to accept that it's important to do applied work. We have this sort of standard way of doing it. And so I guess we need to keep doing it that way. But I think it's really time that we step back and rethink what we can learn, because we're missing a ton of great opportunities, I think, to contribute knowledge to the community.
Thank you. I like this extreme view. I think it will move us forward. Natalia Andrienko has a question. Is all this specific to visualization design, or is it also applicable to design of analytical frameworks? I guess also since we are here at EuroVA. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I mean, I think this approach is really a great approach for how we would design technology in general for people in the world. And so I think it absolutely applies to folks who are working more on analytic systems and because again, I think there as well, I think what I've seen in the Viz community, that it's really about very smartly putting together things that exist in the world, but putting them together in some sort of new way that supports new functionality for a group of people, which is important work in the way that we have impact. But I think, again, unclear what we as a community learn from that. And I think the act of doing that, the act of learning about new techniques, whether they're visual or analytic, and the act of understanding how those impact people when we put them out there, is the thing that we can learn from. So yeah, absolutely. I think that this kind of thinking applies to just about any applied work that we do in the community.
Thank you. So Annalena Keith has a question quite to the point. How long does a design study usually take? I guess it's a longer answer.
Yeah, a long answer for a long time. Yeah, this, and yes, okay, awesome question. I think it takes a long time. And this is the sort of thing that I'm still grappling with too. Like, am I comfortable advocating for an approach to research that takes more time? I mean, as I said, more time, it takes a whole bunch more training and skills. Like, not only do we have to be strong in design and engineering and analytics, but now we also have to be good reflective practitioners. We have to be great at interviewing. Like, there's just this host of things that now we have to be good at, which is really overwhelming. And so that's something we struggle with in our group as well. But this design study that we just had last year, this one with the lizard biologists, it, from start to finish, it was about 1.5 years. And that was because we went into it very focused. Many design studies I've done in the past, I've gone into being like, well, let's just see what's going to happen. And this was the first design study where we went in with an agenda, which was, we want to test, how we actually, make something transparent. How do we make a design study abundant? And so Jen was very focused throughout that design study on establishing these criteria. And it was really amazing how we at the end, ended up with a wealth of things that we learned, that we pulled from. So I do think that doing this kind of work is possible in a sort of more typical 1.5 year design study timeframe. But I do think it's really hard and requires a lot of skills that many of us just don't bring to the table automatically. So, and let me just say the one other thing, since I'm on a soapbox, the one other thing I think that's really hard is writing about these kinds of design studies in our very constrained 9-page papers. It just does not work. And the fact that we had this abundant collection of artifacts and we had to put it all in supplemental materials is, it makes it hard and difficult. And so anyway, I just think that, this is deep qualitative work, and deep qualitative work takes a lot of space to write in a convincing way. And so I think increasingly our very, standard ways of reporting on this kind of work are going to get in the way.
I guess speaking of constraints, Petra Isenberg asks, how does a design study align with the short PhD times in some European countries? And is 3 years enough?
Oh my goodness. Right. Oh, that's so hard. Yeah, it's a great question. And my answer is that, for example, I think a design study that can take a number of years can result in multiple papers afterwards. So I'll just use Jen Rogers, who led this design study with the lizard biologist. So she conducted this design study. It took us about 1.5 years. We had this nice paper last year at Biz. And based upon what we learned, we took one of our methodological insights, and that is now becoming the whole core of her dissertation. And so she's working on a sort of theoretical type of approach to this and developing some tools to support this notion of tracing. And so, we're hoping that, within 1 year, she's going to have another 1 to 2 papers about this kind of work. And so I've seen this, and I see this playing out in a number of my students, where we have this sort of long, intense study period of like maybe even up to 2 years. But after we've gone through this rich process, suddenly like we're writing papers like furiously. I have another student where it's the same thing. He has 2 papers under review at the same time from a 3-year longitudinal study that we just did. So I think it's a huge challenge, but again, I think that it's one of these shifts where we're so used to being able to do a project in less than 1 year that it feels risky to say I'm going to spend 2 years on this design study and hope to get 3 papers out, but I think it's absolutely possible.
Okay, thank you. Petra has a follow-up question. I wonder if there's some more transfer into some domains that are larger, for example, medical viz, bio-viz, that we are probably not doing enough as a visualization community. I think we have this conversation or the discussion for many years now. How can we have more impact on these other application domains? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I feel like we have had this impact where we're designing tools with biologists and with other folks, who are creating analytic tools in biology. So I don't want to discount the impact that we as a community have had by bringing standards of good biz practice, all the things that we've learned about perception and cognition into that community and making them aware. But I also think, for example, methods are something that when I've talked with folks in other domains who are designing tools, they get really excited about methods. So these creativity workshops I talked about, for example, when I present on those to non-viz audiences, it's often the thing in a talk I get asked about most. They're just like, well, how do you conduct them? And what are the techniques you use? because I think, how to, your typical biologist or bioinformatician, they don't learn about design processes. They don't learn about participatory design. They don't learn about workshops. They don't learn about rapid prototyping, So I think there's, this is another opportunity. We do become design experts. I don't think we often think of ourselves that way, but thinking about how we, the things we've learned by, trying different kinds of things as we design tools is also a huge thing that we could feed back to these communities who, are trained in very different ways of thinking. And because of that, I think are constrained in the kinds of things they ultimately end up designing. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that regard for us to contribute just very pragmatic, actionable kinds of things back as well.
Okay, Angelos Chatsimparampas, I would pronounce, has a question on how hard is it to, the question is about the pandemic and how you collaborate for a design study. And I guess maybe I can expand a bit on that to say, how shall we continue now that everyone's talking about, well, maybe we have collaborations virtually much more often now. But do you think design studies can work, or can we collaborate in a virtual way as good as, or in a good way for design studies?
Yeah, there's a part of me that wants to be really positive and be like, yes, we can totally do it. We figured it out, guys, it works. Honestly, I had one student who was doing a design study. She started it shortly before the pandemic ended, and we did not end up with particularly spectacular results. There's just part of it, I think, was pandemic induced. 6 months in, we were all kind of done with talking to each other digitally and having to, do yet another digital whiteboard session. So I think the experiences we've had aren't necessarily what it might look like long term. I will say that I'm kind of amazed at some of the digital tools now that are out there and that I've seen improved over the pandemic. Obviously, Zoom, we all use it. We use a tool called Miro extensively, which is basically a digital whiteboard with Post-it notes and sketching. And it's really good. And actually, we're going to keep using it for brainstorming and collecting ideas. And we've even tried conducting some creativity workshops virtually, and they're okay. But I think as a way to sort of supplement traditional sorts of in-person things that we do, I think we can actually make it work. And I think that the thing that it potentially opens up, as you mentioned, is the opportunity to work with people we wouldn't have otherwise. I imagine that for me, I'm still going to always try to have some in-person parts, especially when you're establishing those initial relationships that are so important to making a design study successful. But maybe after we've established those relationships, there's going to be ways that we can actually meet more frequently, that we can meet with more people by using some of these virtual tools that we've come to really know and love. So I'm optimistic, tentatively optimistic that we will be able to augment what we do. But I think for me, I'm not going to attempt to do a design study with never having any face-to-face with people. Also, it's kind of the most enjoyable part, right? I think for many of us who do design study, part of why we do it is because we just really enjoy the people we're working with and getting to know them. And all of that is so much better in person than on Zoom.
I agree. Till Nagel is thinking about your or the approach to collect artifacts and also deep link these in your paper. He asked, what do you think about ways of publishing them as first-class citizens, for example, through pictorials or other richer publication formats, such as interactive articles?
That is such a great idea. Wonderful question. I have not thought about that, but I really hope someone does. Yeah, you can imagine, we're thinking a lot about this idea of trace. So if we have this, if we've collected all these abundant artifacts that really are a trace of the design process and thinking you've gone through, and in them sort of illustrate the evolution of ideas and insights that we've had, there's got to be interesting ways to create traces that aren't just about talking about them in a paper. That's one of the things that we're sort of experimenting with, is what are other visual ways to represent traces, to even just to develop traces as you go through a process. And I suspect that, a paper is absolutely not going to be the thing that is the sort of most interesting and insightful way to present them. And yeah, I think that there's all these other mediums of, ways of publishing that other communities, especially like the HCI and design community, have embraced that could be super interesting for Viz, and particularly for, this kind of work that I think lends itself to being able to dig in and explore people's evidence in a very visual way. So I think we need new ways of reporting on what we do. And I think that once we have these abundant collections of artifacts, I do think that there would be so many interesting opportunities.
Cool, thanks. Kevin Allow has an interesting question. I think a problem that happens, unfortunately, often is encountering different names for the same visualization methods in different fields. Do you think the trace approach, I don't know how to pronounce it with a rolling R, maybe the trace approach could help to avoid that?
On sort of overloading of terms, like ill-defined terms?
Yeah, that you have the same visualization methods in different fields that actually do the same thing, but you have different names for these in different application fields, probably also. Yeah, I think that's what he means there.
Yeah, I don't know how traces could help with that, but I mean, that is definitely something that I find a lot, like, and inevitably at the start of many projects, like, the first thing you have to do is establish a common language. And in fact, I had this one project where it was with some biologists, and they kept talking about segmenting of the data. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize you were using like segmentation algorithms and stuff. That's pretty sophisticated. And it turns out, no, they were talking about the biological segmentation response that happens in embryos. Okay, so anyway, that only took like 3 months to figure out. But yeah, I think that this problem that we have of like even coming up with a common language with our collaborators is really typical. I don't have good solutions for that other than to, I think part of us going in and learning about a domain is also the flip side is about having our collaborators learn about what we do. In the workshops that we run, we always have this one, we always have this one activity where we actually are presenting some interesting visualization tools just to help people brainstorm and think creatively. And so I think things like that are always an opportunity to get people on the same page. Another thing we do a lot is increasingly when we do design study, our students go and do field studies. So like they go and spend 3 to 6 months sort of embedded in the workplace of the people we work with. And then one of the things we do in the very first week is have those students give a presentation on like design study, what we do, what our expectations are, what are the kinds of things we're hoping to get out of, the field study. And that's another way that we found that sort of pretty quickly up front can set expectations and help establish common language and help talk about shared goals. It was a bit of a tangent to that question, but hopefully there was something useful in it.
Thank you. So I have a question by Roy Ruddle here, probably elaborating a bit on my first question. I mean, sometimes he writes, another type of design study applies well-known types of Viz to an application problem, and the research contributions stem from the way those Viz techniques are integrated, and not so much since that they are new techniques. It seems challenging to publish those papers as well. What's your experience with this? I mean, you touched on this a bit in your talk.
Yep. There's I'm trying to remember where I saw this. There's a really nice paper from the Chi community. I think it was published at Alt Chi a number of years ago, that argues for this very idea that if you take a bunch of existing things and put them together in a new way that affords new functionality, but that is novel. And I think that's what the question is getting at. And I think that that's one of the things we do all the time in design study, whether we're designing visual tools or analytic tools, is often taking things that we know to be good, good standards of practice and putting them together to afford new functionality. And I agree, that kind of thing is also still really hard in our community to argue for. I think that the thing, though, that I see sometimes, especially in reviewing papers, is that authors don't take that step to help us really understand like what that functionality is in a more sort of general abstract way, and why it's really important and compelling beyond a use case of 3 people. So I absolutely agree that the sort of unique combinations of things are really important. But I do think that as a community, we have to work to generalize those ideas and to be better at arguing that this sort of novelty is really important for us in some way. And I think that if we can have those kinds of more general discussions around the specific things we create, it helps other people to transfer that kind of thing and be like, oh, and they put these 3 views together, because they have this sort of problem in their, or this sort of challenge in their problem space. Maybe I could transfer that kind of thing too. But I really do think that we can take our readers a long way towards understanding that transfer is possible by being able to step back and reflect and talk at a higher level about why this unique combination is innovative and interesting.
Thank you. So I'm picking out one more question as a last question by Çağatay Turkay. Do you have any typical sense or smell a successful design study project before you even started? From your experience, is it usually about the data complexity, the problem complexity, or the openness of collaborators? What tips you off to say, I will go for this design study?
Yeah, it's such a good and fun question. I'd have to say that every collaboration I've had that has been like really interesting, largely has been with people I'm excited to work with. And I can't stress that, and part of that is my own bias. The thing I love most about these design studies is getting to go off and meet new people and work in new spaces. But I think also, I've also found that being able to pick projects that are in domain areas where those domains are clearly making a big impact or sort of like exciting also has really, just as like a publishing strategy, has really helped. So for example, we had a project with poets a number of years ago, but it was right when digital humanities was really becoming sort of a bigger thing. And we hadn't seen there, there was some of it at Viz, but not a ton yet. And that project just got so much visibility, in part because it was like, poetry, that's really cool. We have a design study that a student of mine is getting ready to start this fall with a social scientist at Duke who has been all over the news because he studies political polarization. And he's just a really great person. I really enjoy talking with him. And so we have no idea what's going to happen, but given the amount of publicity that his group gets, we suspect that no matter what, it'll be a high visibility project. And so I think that there is some strategy to, picking projects that are going to get visibility. But in the end, it really just comes down to, for me, like people that I can spend the next 2 years working with.
Thank you so much for also answering so many questions, and thank you to the audience for posting so many questions.
Thanks so much for this opportunity. This was awesome.
Really interesting. Thank you very much, Miriah. So, continuing right after the last question that we posted to Miriah, I'm here now in my role as EuroVA steering committee member. I'm proudly doing that with Daniel Keim for a number of years now. And at this point of time, we really want to thank Çağatay Turkay for his great service to EuroVA in 2019 and 2020. One real life event in Porto and one virtual event in Sweden, in Linköping, Norrköping, and it was a great job in both times. And we really, really want to thank you as a whole community actually to do this. And thank you so much. You will get this, I will send you this certificate of appreciation, and we will also have a little present together with this. Thank you so much. And what I also would like to do at this point, since they will take the mic away from me in a second, is to thank Katerina and Jürgen for this year's work on EuroVA, which was a great EuroVA. I think a great selection of papers. I'm not talking about the best paper, since I have to just enjoy this in silence. But thank you so much for your hard work and for a great EuroVA 2021 already.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jörn. I think I can speak for us both. Pleasure is on our side. It was a lot of fun beforehand today, and I guess also in the next coming weeks and months when we will talk about journals, but that's something we talk about later. Jörn, let me thank you for doing the session share right now and doing it so nicely, and the questions together with Miriah. And I'm proceeding with my slides and coming back to the keynote. Actually, I took some screenshots of Miriah, and while she was presenting, I also observed her talk quite actively when she walked us through a design study, definition, and the different papers that have been published so far, cases, and also her work with Jason Dyke more recently. Very, very nicely delivered. Thank you very much, Miriah. It was a pleasure having you, and we are very, very happy that you decided to do it. Thank you very much.
I could also say thank you very much. Thank you also to Chagatai for a great collaboration last year, and thank you for this very interesting keynote talk. And I'm really looking forward to welcome you to Norrköping, to Linköping University next year or after the summer. So it has been a really interesting day today. We have had numerous interesting presentations, interesting questions and answers. We will spend just a few minutes having some closing remarks, a little bit of a recap, and extending our thanks to everybody that has been a part of making EuroVA successful for another year. Even though we haven't been live, we haven't been interacting, I'm still impressed by the amount of interaction that we achieved, even though things are digitally, and I'm really content to have all these different tools that make it a bit more personal and a bit more possible to still keep exchanging ideas and sharing between us. So a little recap of the day. I would like to congratulate again the honorable mention based on honorable mention paper award, which has gone to Dario Antweiler, David Sisler, Sebastian Ginzel, and Jörn Kohlhammer for their paper towards the detection and visual analysis of COVID-19 infection clusters. Congratulations once again. And big congratulations to the Best Paper Award that has gone to Jan Bunmeister, Jürgen Bernard, and Jörn Kohlhammer for LFPR's temporal similarity search in COVID-19 data. Congratulations to both papers, and thank you for your great presentations today. Next. Thank you for everybody that has participated today through all these means, all these digital means that we have had. Thank you for the live conversations and Q&As that we have listened to and participated over the day.
Yeah, the last one was from YouTube. This is from Discord. Both channels heavily used. Great, very, very, very good collaboration. Thank you for that. Very good feedback. I absolutely appreciated that throughout so many of the talks. I did some statistics because I love it, and came up with a bundle line chart of all the 4 sessions and the participants over time throughout every session. First session blue, second session green, third one in yellow, and fourth one in red. And one thing that stands out is that on average, we had a constant number of at least 50 participants all day, which is fantastic in my opinion, given that it's so nice to be distracted in those days in this virtual reality environments. I'm absolutely delighted about that. You may ask where the peak has been. It seems that there has been the peak in the second session, which would have been about 63 participants here. But it is very likely that if I would have had the time to continue the Miriah talk, that she has made it to the peak finally. Also interesting to see that in session 3, there seem to have been very, very good sessions, other sessions as well, so that we could not keep the pace overall the whole day. I did a quick look up in other sessions. This has been a very, very strong and competitive session. We would like to thank once again our 4 session chairs. In my opinion, they did a great job, absolutely great job. Many, many good questions, constructive questions, examples. And it was not easy to collect all these information from the different chats and present it so nicely. Thanks to all 4 of you. And while in this slide you look so professional and yeah, so photographed, in this slide you actually look like you have been looking today in the 4 different sessions. So very, very much in-depth, concentrated, focused, and all 4 doing a great performance. Thank you very much. This brings me to the authors and presenters. Once again, we had 3 sessions subdivided into one, which was about immersive visual analytics and interaction. The second one was about VA approaches and workflows. And the third one was about time series and or clustering. Many of these things should be familiar to you, as you may have seen them throughout the day. And once again, thanks to all the authors that have contributed. This is again the list that we have compiled. No, that's not true. Actually, Stefanie Binke has compiled it and sent it to us as a preview of the proceedings, which is almost available. That is the authors list. Thanks again to the IPC. Yeah, I won't get tired in saying that I think we have a very, very strong IPC, and I'm already looking forward to work with you next year again. And this brings me to the WIS organizers ourselves. Thanks, Jörn, for the thanks to us. I appreciate it. It was so much fun so far. This is the whole overview of all 5 of us. What I may could do in addition is to say that Michael Behrisch is at the University of Utrecht, and of course Jörn Kohlhammer and Daniel Keim are at the Constance University, and Jörn Kohlhammer at the University of Darmstadt Technical University, and the Fraunhofer IGD. This is something that we may want to add at this point. And this brings me to a slide which is called Next, and I will hand over to Katerina.
So just what comes next after this. So we are going to make contact the authors of the highest ranked papers, of the selection of the best papers that have been presented to the EuroVA today, and invite them for extending their papers into a full paper to be published in a special issue of a journal, Computer and Graphics Journal. So we will be in contact with you soon. And for next year, next EuroVA 2022, we keep fingers crossed that it will be live next year in Rome, Italy, co-located again, of course, with EuroVis 2022. So that is very exciting news. And hopefully we can meet all in person and enjoy another successful EuroVA workshop.
Absolutely.
And yes, and with that, I think that we want to thank once again all authors, all presenters, all contributors to EuroVA, all participants, and thank you all for making this workshop a success. It has been a very interesting day, and it has been a pleasure to be part of it.
Nothing more to add from my side. Details about the Rome continuation coming soon. And we would like to end with a pointer to what is going on today next, which will be the virtual city tour starting at 6 p.m. There is a URL coming up, a Zoom link where you can simply click on and be part of it. Looking forward to it. I will also participate. And yeah, this concludes EuroVA for this year. It was a pleasure, and greetings from Zurich.
Thank you.